Like a ghost, a killer managed to escape a crime scene and has never been caught. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Chaim Weiss. Viewer discretion is advised. Chaim Weiss was born on September 29th, 1971. And at the time of this case, he is living in Long Beach, New York. Chaim was one of 3 children, and his grandparents were actually refugees who escaped the Nazis. Chaim and his family were Orthodox Jews, and Chaim at the time of this case was attending the Torah High School in Long Beach, New York, and part of the high school there was a dormitory that all of the students lived in, or most of the students lived in. The dormitory that he was living in was located on 63 East Birch Street, and he was living on a 3rd floor room, and he was one of the very few students, if only, who actually did not have a roommate. He had his own room. Torah High School, I guess, was a yeshiva, and that's a school that it really kind of emphasizes the religious principles of Orthodox Judaism. It's very much about making sure the traditions of Orthodox Judaism is taught. I honestly don't really know a whole lot about Chaim Weiss, as who he was. I do know at the time of this case, he was a 15-year-old kid. The little I do know is that he was described as a very kind young man, very mature for his young age. He was generous, he was outgoing, he was joyous, he was full of energy, full of laughter. He loved playing basketball, and he was, by all regards, considered one of the favorites at the school. He was liked by everyone. There was really no one who openly disliked him. There was no one who ever picked on him. From what I understand, he had no enemies at school or even outside of school. The dormitory he was staying in housed roughly 40 students or so. The room he was living in, basically there was one way in, one way out, and that was the door. There was a window to his room, but again, this is on the 3rd floor. There's no ladder access on the outside of it. So the only way someone gets into that room and out of it is through his bedroom door. So this story actually happened on Halloween night in 1986. The day was really, really normal for Chaim, and he went to classes. He attended, I guess, the services that were after class. And then he was seen going back to his dormitory after the services were done. Later on in the evening, now because with Orthodox Judaism, from what I understand, I'm not too well versed on them, but I know, I guess at the school they really practice this, that the students would have no lights on in their rooms, and that was part of kind of like the codes of conduct. And so they would keep the lights on in the hallways, and that's where many students would usually read at night, is in the hallways. And so there were a couple of students who noticed that Chaim was outside in the hallway later that night, on Halloween night, reading a book. He seemed completely normal. He was just lost in his reading, and that was pretty much it. The time that the students say they saw him reading in the hallway was at approximately 1 a.m. Now, on November 1st, 1986, at approximately 7 a.m., one of the staff there at the dormitory noticed that Chaim was late for the Shabbat prayer. And so the staff would go to his dorm room to check on him to see what was going on. I believe, from some places I read, he was actually kind of sick around this time. Like, nothing major, but just like a cold or something like that. So they kind of just at first assumed that maybe he overslept because of that. But it wasn't that. When the staff member entered his room, it was something that they were not expecting to see. 15-year-old Chaim Weiss was lying halfway on the floor and halfway on the bed. The image I'm showing for this is a recreation from the show Unsolved Mysteries. It's not the actual image. But Chaim Weiss, this 15-year-old kid, was dead. There was a blood stain on his pillow. There was a blood stain on the floor a few feet from where he was, and then underneath him was another blood stain. What the coroner would later determine was that Chaim was killed with at least 2 very sharp blows to the back of his head with something like a hatchet or some kind of bladed weapon. Everybody there would tell detectives, or at least the people who saw the crime scene, would tell detectives that it was evident that whoever may have done this may have been an Orthodox Jew as well, or Orthodox Judaism played into this. Now, because the Shabbat prayers were going on, there really were no witnesses to this, because no one can say they saw him after 1 o'clock in the morning and up until the point where he was found. So there's a 6-hour gap of time between when he was last seen alive and when he was found dead. And so everyone was at the prayer, so nobody saw anything. So where Orthodox Judaism plays into this is when Chaim was found halfway on the floor, and according to, the Orthodox, it's the body, once a person is dead, the body has to be at the lowest, coolest point of wherever they are. So in the room, the floor would have been the lowest and coolest point. It was very obvious that his body had been moved not once, but twice. He was obviously killed while he was in bed. He was then moved to the floor. They then moved him again. So they believe they moved him to the floor out of, I don't know if it was out of respect for Orthodox Judaism or what. So I don't know if that means the killer was trying to respect that. It seems kind of unclear. But the other thing is that Chaim's dorm window was open, and it was freezing cold. I mean, it was really, really cold this particular evening. So there's no reason why the window would have been opened, especially considering Chaim was sick with something like a cold around this time. So the detectives learned that this was a customary thing to do in the room that someone dies. You're supposed to leave the window open that allows their spirits to leave. Another thing that goes with the Orthodox is they would one of the staff would light a candle in the room where Chaim was killed, and it was supposed to be as like a gesture of sympathy for Chaim. It's part of their custom. And it was supposed to be in the room and lit for 7 days. And it's just one candle. However, when they come back into the room like a day or so later, there's a second larger candle placed and lit next to the other one. The interesting thing about this is because this was now a crime scene, the room was sealed and the students were basically moved out of the dorm room temporarily. So who got into the room to put that second candle in there? There was no evidence of anyone entering or leaving the room. There was no, first of all, the murder weapon wasn't in the room. There was no blood drippings coming from whatever weapon they were using, from the bed to the door down the hallway. There was no blood at all outside of the room. No blood on the handles, no blood on the floor, the doors, nothing. There were apparently, from what I understand, no fingerprints. There was, however, a single strand of hair left behind that did not belong to Chaim. It was just a tiny piece of hair, though. So this could potentially be DNA evidence. However, to my understanding at this point, they still haven't tested it for DNA because once you test it, it's destroyed because it's such a tiny piece of hair. But that was the only evidence of the killer in the room. And it's borderline scary and creepy because they couldn't have left through the window. First of all, no one saw someone putting a giant ladder outside of the room. Someone would have noticed and heard something. There were windows below his room. People would have heard this. So no one came in through the window, but that means someone came in through the door. The other interesting thing and kind of the creepy thing is that they were wondering at first, was this a targeted attack or was it random? Well, the thing, like I said earlier, is that Chaim was one of only, I think, 2 total students who had their own room. And so the killer had to know that. And the killer, their names aren't on their doors. And I don't even think there's door numbers on their doors. It's just, so the killer had to know that Chaim, as a single occupant room, was in that particular room. So it appears targeted. So is that how they entered? And the thing is nobody saw anybody out of place. Nobody saw or heard anyone walking around the hallways at that time of night. Now, granted, a lot of them were probably asleep. There was one student who said they think they heard their dorm room door open and then immediately close. And that person just assumed it was the roommate that person had in the room with them. But that was it. But what about the witnesses? What about what they may have heard or overheard? Or, when police tried to ask all the other students questions, what do they have to say? Nothing. Literally nothing. Another aspect to Orthodox Judaism that played into this, especially the investigation portion, is this happened after the Sabbath. And according to custom, no one was allowed to say anything to police if they don't have proof of what they're saying, or any evidence or additional witnesses to back up what they're saying. So essentially, because of their custom, they were not allowed to point the finger or accuse or, suggest anything if that person didn't have actual proof of it. They could not just speak on rumor, and they could not just speak on hearsay. It was part of the custom. So that also made the investigation kind of difficult. So detectives are kind of at a loss. They were like, well, we can't question anyone. They were allowed to polygraph several students and many faculty members, but none of those tests came back with anything concerning. As far as they knew, nobody was lying about what they knew. There was no forced entry into his room. So the door wasn't kicked in. There was nothing stolen from his room. Nothing was rummaged through. He was not sexually assaulted. He was just killed with a couple of blows to the back of the head with a hatchet-like weapon. And then the killer just left like a ghost, just completely vanished without being seen. So they wanted to find out, okay, well, what was Chaim like at school? What was he doing the day of? Again, by all accounts, what people were allowed to say about the case when they were questioned was that Chaim was a really likable kid. Everybody seemed to like him. He didn't ever get into any fights. He didn't have any enemies. He just was your normal kid in school. He was super nice. He was popular, super intelligent. He had been at that yeshiva for about 2.5, close to 3 years. His dad would say that as far as they knew, Chaim never said there was any problems with kids at school. Chaim said he always felt very comfortable there, very happy there, very content. His dad, Anton, would later be interviewed and say that, perhaps there were things going on at the school that maybe they weren't considered normal, but they were normal for kids. It was just like normal kid stuff. But none of that would suggest anything. Chaim's mom actually didn't even want Chaim to go to the yeshiva, but Chaim said, I need to go. I feel like I will do really well there, and it'll help me with my future, and I'll excel there. Again, like I said earlier, after they interviewed people with what they were allowed to say, there was nothing abnormal about Chaim the day of his murder. He went to class, he studied, he went to services afterwards. He was seen reading in the hallway like many students do, like he did all the time. That wasn't unusual. And then he was just killed. And then they're trying to focus on how the killer even did this. How did they get in? The dormitory, from what I understand, isn't like a secured building. Like, it isn't like Fort Knox or anything, so it's relatively easy to enter. There was a stairwell that led from, one exit of the building on the bottom floor that would have gone right up to the third floor, right by where Chaim's room was. And he or she could have entered that way, but they're not really sure. They don't have fingerprints or shoe impressions or anything to link to anyone. Chaim's room was at the end of a hallway that he would have passed by. The killer would have passed by several rooms and some wood floors. It would have been loud footsteps. Nobody heard a thing. Or nobody is sharing they heard anything because they couldn't back it up with proof. So it is possible that there were witnesses who may have seen or heard something, but because of custom, they weren't allowed to talk about it without having that backup, that proof. They tried seeing if there was anyone in Chaim's outside life that may have led to this, but they couldn't find anything. They would put out, in the newspapers and on the news, we need tips, we need something, we need anything, because we're not getting much help from the students or the staff because of customs, which is understandable, and they do have to respect that, but nothing from the outside world either. The detectives on this case could not come up with a suspect because of how positive Chaim's life was. They couldn't even come up with a motive. Like, why did this happen? Who did this? For what reason? A strange person went directly to Chaim's room and butchered him with some kind of hatchet and then just left. Again, like a ghost, like the wind. There was only one person who ever came forward with any type of evidence. I guess a jogger on the morning that Chaim's body was found. The jogger was doing his normal jog. At about 7 o'clock in the morning, he saw a young teenage boy sitting on the bench just a block or two away from the yeshiva. The jogger went to police with this information because he thought maybe this was a student from the school. Maybe this was a student that escaped the school or something, but any attempts they have made to identify that particular student has gone unanswered, unsuccessful. An FBI profiler would be brought in, and they came up with, their own profile, their theory that the killer was likely, or probably more than likely, definitely someone that Chaim knew, and that this is probably someone that knew him very well and was probably about the same age as him. The profile says that the murder was very likely pre-planned. This was a premeditated murder. This was not an act of randomness. They think that Chaim's success, Chaim's intelligence, Chaim's likability may have been the driving factor that led to the killer's motivations. That this may have been like an act of anger, jealousy. And the killer is also considered highly intelligent and someone that could plan this kind of attack and be able to get away with it for as long as they have, but also to not really leave any traces of themselves. Like they entered that room and they left that room without anybody seeing or hearing, without any physical evidence of their existence in that room, other than a tiny piece of hair that they're terrified to test because it could be destroyed. And they're not even sure if it has DNA in it. One theory that some people have come up with was that it was Halloween night. There was rumors from the outside, not coming from the students directly at the school, but from the outside, that some of the kids at the school may have been picked on or taunted by kids from the outside on Halloween nights, like eggs being thrown at them, tricks being done. and there was confirmed that there were like neighborhood kids, or thugs that they called them, that were kind of just being assholes that night. But none of that led to, that connected to the investigation at all. Because there's no evidence that Chaim was even part of the kids that were being harassed. Could have been a random, this is Halloween, and so maybe someone wanted to do something crazy on Halloween, and they wanted to do a thrill killing because of the holiday. And what better place to do it, right, than in, this yeshiva? But police were like, based on the profile the FBI gave, they're like, that doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem like that's probably what happened here. I mean, maybe, but unlikely. His case just went cold, and because of the uncooperativeness of the fellow students, again, for customary reasons, which is completely understandable and respectable. But the case was at a standstill, and there was really nothing else they could do because they got nothing from anyone. They would reopen the case in 2013 as a cold case. They interviewed about 100 or so former students from the school plus staff. They even went to Israel to see if they can track down students who were there that had then traveled, obviously many, many years later. But still, they weren't getting any more information from anyone. But it's in 2013 when police would pretty much announce that whoever killed Chaim was almost certainly a student or a faculty member at that school. There were no faculty or staff members present in the dorm room, however, dormitory, on that night, which is actually a criticism that Chaim's parents would later come up with, how come there were no adults in the dormitory that night? The other criticism is that the exit door by where, the killer may have entered and come up to the third floor, that door had been broken for some time, and for a very long time, and they never bothered to repair it. If that's how the killer entered, then that's a problem. In 2017, Chaim's dad, Anton, would do an interview, and he kind of brought forth some, not new information necessarily, but just some bits of tidbit, Apparently in July of 1986, a few months before the murder would happen, Chaim was attending a summer camp. And at one point, I guess he called home, and he called home crying and saying that he really wanted to come home. And that was not normal for Chaim. This was completely abnormal because he always got along with everyone. So then Anton would go to the summer camp shortly after this to visit him, but then Chaim was back in good spirits and he was happy. Then in August, Chaim would visit, of 1986, Chaim would go and visit Europe. He would visit his grandparents. Apparently, while Chaim was in Europe, he received at least 2 phone calls from the principal of the yeshiva he had been attending, where he was eventually killed. And apparently, this rabbi kept asking Chaim when he was returning back to the States. When Chaim got back to the States, apparently this rabbi asked if he could come to the rabbi's house for a conversation. So Anton, his dad, would take him to the rabbi's house. Chaim would go inside, have this conversation, while Anton and Chaim's mom stayed outside. When Chaim got back to the car, he seemed incredibly reluctant to say what the conversation was about. And then a couple months later, Chaim is found murdered in his room. Anton would, in this interview in 2017, would say it's one of his biggest regrets that he didn't press further into what this conversation was with this rabbi. And there were attempts for news stations to go and interview the rabbi, but he would always be really go away. I don't want to be on camera. You can see you on camera being go, get out of my face. Not saying he's a suspect, it's just that, these are questionable things. Why were you calling him, this 15-year-old student of yours, while he was on vacation? Why did you want him to go to your house? But it hasn't led anywhere at this point. Chaim's family would eventually sue the yeshiva, and this is because they failed to protect him, obviously. They didn't repair the broken door. I guess during one of the court hearings with regards to this lawsuit, that same rabbi would kind of be accusatory towards Anton, his dad, Chaim's dad. And he apparently said something along the lines of that Anton needed to reflect on any bad deeds that he may have committed, considering what happened to his family. It was very cryptic and kind of strange. In an interview again in 2017, 2018, a former student of the same yeshiva who also had the same rabbi as the school's principal said that between 1976 and 1977 that this student had been abused by a faculty member and that the rabbi was keeping it hush-hush. It wasn't the rabbi committing the assaults or whatever you want to call it, but the rabbi knew about it and was just allowing it to keep happening. A couple of years before Chaim's murder, another student had ended their own life in the dormitory. For what reasons, I'm not really sure. But was there something going on in that dormitory at that school that wasn't reported, that was being kept very hush-hush? Is this another reason why the students didn't want to talk? Were they afraid? I do understand they had their customs to not talk, but were the staff there forcing them to not talk and not saying anything? It sounds like something was going on in that school. I mean, it doesn't even sound like it. It looks like something was definitely going on in that school between staff and students. But what that exactly is not 100% known. I know detectives know about it, but they can't do much without physical proof or physical evidence. They also can't do anything if no one is going to talk, if no one is going to come forward. This is now decades later, and they are still pleading to the students who were there, now decades later, please come forward. Please have a change of heart. I understand the customs, but please, this is about solving a murder. One of your fellow students was brutally killed inside his own dorm room by a whisper. Who did this? They just need to know. His family deserves that. And so they're just pleading still. Please, if you have any information at all to please come forward. Somebody somewhere out there, I think in this case, definitely knows the truth. I think that someone knows exactly what happened, and I think that someone heard something or saw something, and they are just hoping against hope that you do the right thing and come forward. So if that person is you, please, you can contact anonymously. Please call 1-800-244-TIPS. You can also contact the Nassau County Homicide Line at 516-573-7788. All calls would be kept confidential. You can be anonymous. You don't have to say who you are. You just need to give them the information that'll help solve this case, because there's a killer out there. I mean, at this point, it is 30 some odd years later. The killer may be dead, especially if it was a faculty member. They may not be. There could be a student who did this and they're still alive and well, thriving with their own family and their own kids and their own job, and they're just living their happy life, even though they brutally killed some kid. You gotta help stop that. You have to. This person can't go on living a free life. This was a horrific murder. And for what reason? So please, if you know anything, please come forward. Chaim Weiss was a very good kid. I mean, genuinely good, respected, well-loved, intelligent young man. Someone did this to him, likely because they were jealous of him, possibly. And so Chaim and his parents, his family, they all should get the justice that Chaim rightfully deserves. A young girl was just trying to walk home after leaving her school, but she never got home. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Eileen Beth Misheloff. Viewer discretion is advised. Eileen Misheloff was born on March 12, 1975, and she lived with her family in Dublin, California. Dublin, I guess, is in the Northern California area. I am originally from Southern California, and I lived there for 18 years and never knew Dublin, California existed. Eileen was described as an excellent student in school, always got good grades, and she had a passion for ice skating, and she was very, very good at it. She also was someone who aspired to help people, even at a young age. I mean, at the time of this case, she's 13 years old. But she always dreamt of when she grew up, she was going to become a pediatrician or something in the health environment, because she just wanted to help people and make a difference. At the time of this case, she attended Wells Intermediate School in Dublin. The date was January 30th, 1989. Eileen was in gym class when she was excused from class. This was because I guess she had some prearrangement because she had ice skating practice later that afternoon. Because her parents were at work, Eileen was going to basically walk home first, and then she would go to her ice skating practice, and one of her coaches, like always, was going to pick her up. It was about a 2-mile walk. She left the school at approximately 2:30 p.m. that day. At around 3 p.m., many people, witnesses, saw her walking around Amador Valley Boulevard. And this was near Village Parkway and right by the Shamrock Village Shopping Center. She was also seen by witnesses cutting through an alley, I guess, near that shopping center. And later on, when parents heard this, they thought to themselves, okay, Eileen was doing that to take a shortcut home. And this is something she did all the time. Then they believe that she went through Martin Canyon Creek, which would have brought her to a local park. That park was the Mape Memorial Park. Pretty large little park with a playground and, plenty of openness. The park would be right next to Nielsen Elementary School, which would have been just a block away from where she lived. When her mom, Maddie, got home that afternoon, she expected to see Eileen at the house because she knew Eileen would be there in order to wait for her coach to pick her up. But when Maddie got there, Eileen wasn't at the house. So she thought to herself, maybe the coach picked her up early, or maybe instead she just walked all the way to practice. So her mom would then drive to the ice skating rink where the practice was being held. When she arrived and she spoke to the coach and the other players there. Eileen wasn't there. The coach said Eileen had never been there that day, and when the coach went by her house to pick her up, Eileen wasn't there. Coach said he got to the Mishaloff house sometime a little after 3:30 p.m., which was the predetermined time to pick her up, but she never answered the door. She never came out, so he had to leave and go to the ice skating rink. And, by the way, just in case anyone was wondering, this coach was seen at the ice skating rink literally just minutes later. So, at the ice skating rink, Eileen's mom then calls the house. Maybe Eileen got there late. Who knows? Maybe she's now at the house. She calls, but Eileen isn't there. Maddie, Eileen's mom, then contacts Mike, who is Eileen's dad, and he hasn't seen or heard from her either, so the two of them go to police and report their daughter missing. So Eileen's family, the police, and the community band together, and they begin a very large search for Eileen. They look everywhere. They look in all of the wooded areas. They look in all of the alleys. They look everywhere they can possibly think a person would be. Never found her. However, they did find some evidence near Mape Park, and that's how they knew that Eileen had at least gotten to Mape Park. What they found there was Eileen's keychain. It was a distinctive keychain, I guess. I don't have a photo of it, unfortunately, but it was just at the entrance to the park. A couple of weeks would go by. They then find her backpack, and this is now in, I guess, a creek. What's odd about that is that this creek bed had already been searched in the weeks prior, and including the day she went missing, and they never found anything. This was a dry creek bed at this point, and they never found a backpack. They never found anything belonging to Eileen. But this day, just a couple of weeks after she goes missing, now something is there. So the theory is that whoever may have taken her likely went back there days or weeks later and placed the backpack there. I believe they thoroughly searched the backpack and the keychain for any kind of trace evidence like fingerprints, hairs, anything like that, and they didn't come up with anything. So police at this point, they do believe that Eileen was kidnapped and very likely murdered. In terms of suspects, they did investigate the coaches. That's how they came up. They found the alibi that the coach could not have possibly have taken her and done anything to her just because of the timeline. There's just no way he would have been able to do anything. They investigated, obviously, the family, people at school, and they came up with nobody. They did have a suspect at one point named Timothy Binder. He was also suspected in the kidnappings or disappearance of a young girl named Amanda Campbell, another young girl named Amber Swartz Garcia, and Michaela Garrick. Why he was considered a suspect in all of those, I'm not 100% positive. I do know that he actually sued one of the cities that one of those girls went missing from for defamation, and he won. And he's always maintained his innocence. A couple of days after Eileen went missing, another man who isn't named was arrested trying to kidnap another young girl, but apparently police were able to alibi him and rule him out of being involved in Eileen's disappearance. Another suspect was a man named James DeVeggio. He had later on been convicted of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of a young woman named Vanessa Leigh Sampson. He was sentenced to death for that, where he's still awaiting his execution. But he lived just a couple of miles away from where Eileen disappeared. He had also previously been arrested for other attempted kidnappings and kidnapping, and he kind of served, I guess, a brief amount of times for those, but apparently they never had any evidence to conclude that he had any involvement in Eileen's disappearance. So this case literally just went cold and unsolved. In 2009, when J.C. Dugard was found alive after her kidnapping and disappearance for many years, police looked into the couple who abducted her, Philip and Nancy Garrido. Allegedly, when Eileen disappeared, there was a vehicle spotted in the area at the time that Eileen disappeared. And apparently, Philip drove a car, and they lived in that area at the time, drove a car that was identical to the car that was seen near Eileen. So they were able to search their home for any evidence connecting to Eileen. They found absolutely nothing. There was no connection whatsoever. And apparently, according to direct witnesses, there was never anyone like Eileen at the house. In 2020, a man named David Mish was charged with the kidnapping of another young woman that I mentioned just a little bit ago, Michaela Garrick, who disappeared in Fremont, California. David Mish is suspected to be a serial killer. David Mish's palm print was later identified on the scooter that Michaela was riding the day she disappeared, and that's how they connected him to her case. David Mish also is suspected in the murder of two young women, and their names were Michelle Xavier and Jennifer Dewey. David is currently awaiting trial for those particular cases. Michaela's body has never been recovered. At the time of this video, Eileen Mishloff's body has never been found. David lived in the area and is suspected in Eileen's disappearance, but nothing has connected him to her case yet either. So police had a ton of suspects in Eileen's disappearance. None of them so far have actually panned out. Some of them have been ruled out. The most promising suspect they think is David Mish, considering they have confirmed evidence that he did kidnap and murder other people in that particular area. So he is the most promising one. However, he has never admitted to having any involvement in any of these cases. Like I said, police have no physical evidence to point him to Eileen's disappearance. If Eileen Mishloff is alive today, somehow, some way, she would be about 48 years old. This is an age progression photo of what she may look like today. However, unfortunately, the odds are that she is no longer with us and that she likely died the day that she was taken or sometime shortly afterwards. Likely taken by a predator, possibly a serial killer, a serial kidnapper. Unfortunately, it's not really known. But someone somewhere out there certainly knows the truth. Someone somewhere out there knows what happened to Eileen Mishloff. Eileen's mother unfortunately passed away after battling cancer, so she never got to find out what happened to her daughter. But she does have other family members still alive and still awaiting justice. And so if you have any information about the disappearance of Eileen Beth Mishloff, please contact the FBI field office in San Francisco. You can also send them an email, and you can do these things anonymously. You, if you have any information, can help this family get the closure they deserve. And maybe the family can even put Eileen to rest. The police are supposed to be there to protect and to serve. Well, allegedly in this case, they did the exact opposite. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Emogene Thompson. Viewer discretion is advised. Unfortunately, I do not have a lot of background information on Emogene Thompson. I do know that she was born on February 11th, 1940. She had been married at one point, and I know she had at least one child, a son named Michael, who, according to Find a Grave, actually passed away himself just this year. So this case technically begins on April 3rd, 1993. 53-year-old Emogene Thompson calls the Gwinnett County Police, which is in the state of Georgia, to report that her home had been burglarized and money had been stolen. Officer Michael Chappell is dispatched to her home. He arrives, he asks her some questions, and he finds out that her son Michael was living with her at the house at the time. I'm not sure exactly where her husband was. I don't know the situation with their marriage at that point. So Emogene says she had about $14,000 in cash stored in a secret location in her home. Well, now $7,000 of that is missing. And so Officer Chappell says, well, it kind of sounds like your son, Michael, did it. And eventually she's like, you know what? You're probably right. He probably did steal the $7,000. So guess what? I'm not going to press charges. Officer Chappell tries to convince her to press charges because this is, $7,000 in cash that has been robbed from you. But she says no. But Officer Chappell says, I'm still going to try my best to find the, your stolen or missing money. So what follows next, I'm a little foggy on because it's not really specified anywhere. But according to Imogene's friends and some of her family, she was scheduled to meet Officer Chappell because he apparently, according to Imogene, had recovered some of the money, and he wanted to have her bring the money that she still had at home, and then he can take the money he found and see if the serial numbers line up, if they match. And then the next thing that happens is on April 15th, 1993. Emogene Thompson is now parked at a muffler shop located on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. I don't know for sure if this was the planned location for her to meet Officer Chappell, but that is where she went with the intent at some point that night of matching up this money. Well, sometime that evening, some individuals had walked up and noticed that there was a car just parked in the long driveway leading up to the muffler shop. When they approach the car, they see someone sitting in the driver's seat and sort of slumped over. When they take a closer look, it's a horror story. They find a murdered woman on the driver's seat. It appeared that she had been shot. And so they called 911. The police arrive and they, do confirm that this is a deceased woman, and there was just no saving her. She had a single gunshot wound through her head. They were quickly able to determine that the victim in the driver's seat was 53-year-old Emogene Thompson. They would also discover that she had brought her purse with her, but her purse was nowhere in the car. And so her purse and, as far as they know, $7,000 in cash that she had brought with her that she still had from the robbery, well, that's also missing now. So we have a dead woman and her purse is missing and this cash is missing. Was this just a robbery that turned deadly, or was something else going on? A couple of witnesses would come forward to state that on that night, April 15th, 1993, they had been driving past the muffler shop. And this is, I think, a few different people who were not connected to each other. They saw what would later be determined to be Imogene's car parked in that driveway where it was eventually found. And then they said either parked right next to her or in front of her was a Gwinnett County Police Department vehicle. And again, this is between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. Another witness came forward. His name was Jermaine, and he said that he saw an officer talking to someone in this parked car, which was, again, later to be determined to be Imogene's car. And so they wanted to know what officer this was. And so when they looked into Emogene, they discovered she made that 911 call with regards to the robbery, and that Officer Chappell was the one to respond to that. And so they would find out through Imogene's friends and family that she was scheduled to meet said police officer to compare serial numbers. And so they bring in Officer Chappell, one of their own. They bring him in for questioning because they wanted to know what the situation was. So when they ask him, was that your police car that people saw next to the victim's vehicle? He says, no, I was not there that night. And apparently he was not set up to meet her that night. Again, I'm a little foggy on the plans that they had put together to meet up. There was a pretty bad thunderstorm that night as well. And so Officer Chappell tells these police officers in this interrogation that he had gone to the local fire station to, wait out the thunderstorm. And he said he was there until about 10, maybe a few minutes after 10 p.m. He claims that at 10 p.m. he received a dispatch call that he would respond to, and then at that point he left the fire station. When they questioned a couple of the people from the fire station, they said, yeah, he was definitely here that night, but there appears to be mixed accounts. Some of the people there said that Officer Michael Chappell left sometime between 9:20 p.m. and maybe 9:30 p.m. Others said he left sometime between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. Now, the time of death for Emogene Thompson was determined to be between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Is that exact, though? No. They're basing that solely off of the witness accounts, who could be potentially wrong. Maybe they didn't look at their clock right, or they just kind of guessed the time. But one of these witnesses stated that they saw Officer Chappell driving on the Peachtree Industrial Boulevard, which is where the muffler shop was. So, and that, again, was before 10 p.m. So there were numerous witnesses who saw either just a police car, who they did not know who was in it, One person says they saw him directly. Then you have all these, story accounts from the fire station, people giving differing opinions. And he's like, listen, I took a dispatch call at 10 p.m. You can confirm it. Well, for the longest time, that dispatch call that he said was at 10 p.m. was lost for some reason. But many years down the road, a news station out there, Channel 11, would uncover that dispatch call. You can hear him responding to the call, but the thing is in the background, you can't hear anything else. There's no way they can confirm whether or not he responded to that dispatch call while at the fire station. They had no way to determine that. He also said, well, it would be impossible. If I left there at 9:30 p.m. or 9:40 p.m. or whatever the case may be, there's no way I would have gotten to where she was eventually murdered in time. Prosecution will later state that's actually not true, and they can show and prove that there was plenty of time for him to get to the fire station to where Emogene was, to then be spotted by numerous witnesses outside that muffler shop. However, he continues to deny having anything to do with this murder. They ask him, well, did you really find money? And it doesn't sound like he actually ever provided this money he claims he found that had been stolen from Emogene. Now, there were witnesses who stated that they saw Officer Michael Chappell and his wife at one point paying for things with like $100 bills after this murder happened. But again, police have never been able to collect and confirm that he or his wife or anyone in his home had that stolen money. They did find out, however, that Michael Chappell was having some serious financial difficulties. He had just been facing an IRS audit that would have potentially charged him over $4,000, and also he owed like $1,500 or so to a friend. Now, when his wife was asked about this, she said, we're not having financial issues, we've been doing fine. But that was a potential motive that they came up with. He needed money. He just so happened to respond to this call about, a woman who said a whole bunch of money was stolen from her. She tells him, I have $14,000, or I did. And so that could have been inspiration for him to go, that's a lot of money that I need. Maybe I should break the law to get it. They impound his police vehicle as well as the clothing he was wearing that night, in particular a raincoat. So in the car on the armrest, they allegedly found these little tiny itty bitty drops of what they presumed was blood. They would do a presumptive test to determine whether or not that blood was human blood. However, they never really had a conclusive answer to that because the little drops were just so tiny. Now, this case happened in 1993, but it wouldn't be until 2 years later, on 1995, when they took his raincoat and they looked it over, and they, 2 years after this all happened, found a whole bunch of little tiny itty bitty specks of what they again presumed was blood. They tried to do a presumptive test for human blood. However, not all of it came back as belonging to human. The raincoat, however, was not splashed in obvious blood. If he fired a close-range shot at her head, the blowback would have gotten blood just all over him, possibly. But also, there was a storm that night. It could have washed off his coat, especially if it was freshly on there. Not having any other suspects here, Officer Michael Chappell was arrested. He was charged with the murder. At trial, they presented all of the witnesses who said they saw a police vehicle. Most of them could not confirm if it was Chappell's car or not. They had testimony from the people at the fire station, and some of them would later be kind of discovered to not be very reliable witnesses. But again, there was contradictory reports of he was here until 9:30, he was here until 9:45 or 10. No one seemed to know for sure. And the prosecution also could prove that Michael Chappell could have gotten to the muffler shop in time, no matter when he left that shop. And her actual time of death was not a solid thing that they really had evidence of. It could have been well after 10 p.m. They're just basing that solely off of the witnesses who saw the cop car. The case against Michael was very, very circumstantial at best, and the defense tried to paint a different picture that people did see an officer at the muffler shop next to Emogene's car that night. It just wasn't Michael Chappell's. He would claim that it was another officer named J.P. Morgan. Officer J.P. Morgan had actually been involved with Michael Thompson, who was Emogene's son, that had allegedly stolen that $7,000 in cash to begin with. Now, Michael Thompson had been involved in various drug activities in the area. The defense would bring up a witness named Quint Rutland, who would testify, according to court documents, that he himself had smuggled cocaine into Gwinnett County back in 1991. He paid off Officer J.P. Morgan to keep quiet, and also for protection. Michael Thompson allegedly worked for Quint Rutland. There was no solid proof, though, that Michael Thompson had any involvement with Quint Rutland or this Officer J.P. Morgan. They could not find any actual proof or connection other than what this, drug smuggler is saying on the stand. And so, it is possible that Michael Thompson, her son, was actually involved in her murder with this Officer J.P. Morgan. However, nobody could prove that. There was no evidence of it. And to be quite honest with you, the evidence against Michael Chappell, it's extremely circumstantial. And sometimes circumstantial evidence is great and it works really well. But in this case, it's like you have what people are saying is blood on his raincoat, but you didn't really find that blood until 2 years later. There's so-called blood on the armrest that may have been human blood. They have never tested, by the way, any of that blood for an actual DNA profile. They've only ever done presumptive tests to determine if it was human or animal. And that was also inconclusive. So they couldn't even prove that blood they found was Emogene's. But I think Michael Chappell just I think to people, had to be the guy. He knew about all of this money that Emogene had. He was really the last person to really kind of be in contact with her. According to Emogene, they planned to meet up at some point to look at those serial numbers. So it all added up that they didn't have the physical evidence, but I think they found various guns that Michael Chappell owned. And the only thing is, I don't know if they ever determined if any of the guns he had were involved in the shooting. I'm not positive on that. But I do know they did not present any conclusive physical evidence really against him. However, the jury bought into the circumstantial evidence and he was found guilty by them. And he would end up being convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Chappell has always denied having anything to do with this. And he brought up a good point at one point, saying that if I'm a cop, right, and I'm going to, and I see that I have potential access to $7,000 or $14,000 in cash, why as a cop would I lure this potential victim out into the open, outside of a muffler shop where people were working, on a road that people drove by? Why would I do that and shoot her plain as day where people could see? Why would I leave a paper trail? And that's a logical thing. I mean, it is. But sometimes, police officers are people too, and we as people make a lot of sudden or rash decisions that were really, really bad because we're not thinking, we're just sort of reacting. And that's a possibility. He may not have, as a cop thought, well, I can't do this, but that still ended up doing it anyway because things just got crazy in his head. But what about this Officer J.P. Morgan? Well, I mean, surely there's also just as much circumstantial proof against him that there was against Michael Chappell. Well, the thing is the police will never know, because J.P. Morgan, I think within a few months of all of this happening, ended his own life. He took his life, which kind of adds another layer of suspicion, really. But again, no physical proof he had anything to do with it. No physical proof that her son, Michael Thompson, had anything to do with it. But also, did they really have physical proof that Michael Chappell did this? As recently as just a couple of years ago, his defense team has now basically, they're trying to appeal this to get a new trial. The biggest reason why is because they had a witness who the defense claims said initially during a videotaped interview that he saw another officer next to Emogene's car that night that was not Michael Chappell. The defense is claiming that this guy said this on camera. Well, they had a hard time finding this footage of this interview. And again, Channel 11 News out there in Gwinnett County was able to obtain the evidence boxes. They were able to unseal them, and they found the interview with this witness. His name was Jermaine Rogers. I mentioned him earlier. how he was one of the people who saw an actual cop outside Imogene's car. So again, the defense is saying that Jermaine Rogers had said in this taped interview that he did not see Michael Chappell, but another officer. Well, turns out they were wrong, because when the news station found this tape and they played it, Jermaine Rogers basically says, no, I saw Michael Chappell, Officer Chappell, outside that car. And Michael Chappell was involved in other nefarious dealings in the area. And so that was a big blow to the defense, who were trying to get this appeal to go through. But the defense is also stating that the police handled this case pretty badly, especially because it was against one of their own. The prosecution handled this badly, but the higher courts, while looking through all the evidence and all the court documents, were like, everything seemed to be in normal order here. He got adequate representation, and everyone else did their jobs correctly. Did the detectives hand over all of the evidence, like this Jermaine Rogers thing? It doesn't sound like they did. It sounds like they may have actually been doing some shady things. But the fact of the matter remains is that Officer Michael Chappell is the one who was found guilty of this murder. And a jury saw through all the evidence and went over everything, twice, 3 times, and determined that he was guilty. But is he actually guilty? If I was on his jury, I don't know if I could possibly say, yeah, for sure, with beyond a reasonable doubt, he's guilty. I couldn't say that. Do I kind of feel like he is? Sure. As the facts of the case present themselves through an actual, court documents, yeah, I mean, it does sound like he is certainly someone who could have done this. He had money problems. According to the prosecution, even though his wife is saying, no, he didn't. But then his wife is also adamantly on his side, understandably, because they're a married couple and they've had a happy marriage forever. You have witnesses who stated that they saw him and her spending money that most people didn't think they actually had. Can they confirm that, though? No, they can't. That's just hearsay. That's all it is. And you can't rely on hearsay saying that's proof, because you need proof. You need proof to prove these things occurred. Just someone saying it doesn't make it necessarily true. Do these people have reasons to lie? Maybe people had it out for him. He's a cop, right? A lot of people don't like cops, and so maybe they're just people who are out to get him. I just don't know if I on a jury, and maybe you guys will disagree, and that's fine. I just don't think I could really look at it and go, yeah, definitely guilty, 100% he's guilty. I don't think I could, because I can't. And so in the end, Emogene Thompson was murdered likely for money. I mean, I think that's definitely the motive there, is that she was robbed and she was killed because she would, say who did this. But was it a police officer? Sounds like it was, but do they have the right one? I don't know. Her son, Michael Thompson, like I said towards the beginning, he died this year in 2025, according to Find a Grave, which usually that's fairly accurate. But he was never charged, indicted, or anything to do with this murder or the theft of the money. And, Officer J.P. Morgan, who had dealings with Michael Thompson, well, he's dead. He died shortly afterwards by ending his own life, which is really kind of, it could be potentially a sign of guilt. So, I don't know, man. This one's tricky. I hate when an innocent person is convicted, right? You would rather have guilty people on the streets than have innocent people in prison, and I just don't know if this guy is guilty. But I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy over here in Arizona who has no connection to this case. All I know is the facts that are presented in court documents, and that's all I can do. There is, here in 2025, actually just very recently, in the past couple of months, there is some updates that a judge is looking over this appeal and is going to determine whether or not Michael Chappell should get a new trial or not. But as of me filming this in June of 2025, there is no update on that. The judge is still looking over everything. And so for the time being, the man who allegedly killed Emogene Thompson is in prison, and if he did do it, then that's exactly where he should be forever, especially being a police officer who's supposed to uphold the law and certainly not murder people, supposed to protect and to serve. This is not that. So if he's guilty, and hopefully they have the right person, if he's guilty, then he is where he should be. I just hope that Emogene Thompson, in the end, got the justice she very rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case, True Crime, Aruni, Dooney, Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you are new here, hello, my name is Mike. I tell true crime stories here on the YouTube, obviously, multiple times a week. So please subscribe, give this video a like, leave a comment so more people can see it. Hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Please watch as much of the video as you can. It helps a lot. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. My TikTok page is also named Makingatruecrimerer, just like it's posted here, but you can also find it in the link tree, which is in the description of this video below. So feel free to follow that if you like. I do post compilation videos every month for my previous TikTok videos of that month. Also in that link tree, you're going to find my case list. It is public. You guys can see it. You just can't add to it. It's 7,100 plus names now on there. I pick my cases typically at random. So if you scroll through that list, it's alphabetical for the most part, and you don't see a name on there that you want me to cover, send me a quick email. My email is actually listed in that document where the list is, but also you can find it in the description below. All I need to know is the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened, and I'll add that case to my list. If you have like news articles and stuff for it, that's great. You can always add that too. But I will always look it up as well. If you are a loved one to a murdered person, maybe it's a cold case, maybe it's solved, but you still want their story to be told, or they're a missing person, let me know in the description that you are a direct loved one, and I can make sure that case gets a higher priority. So, but at any rate, that is it for this video, True Crime Haroonies. So until the next case, ta-ta for now.